think tank at Capital One, Director of Business Analytics at FireEye, Special Advisor for the Director of the U.S. Secret Service. She has served on the Board of Directors and Advisors for security companies and nonprofits and advocated for security policies and improvements on Capitol Hill. In addition to CISSP and CEH certifications, she holds an MBA from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, as well as undergraduate degrees in both accounting and finance. I think she's pretty much a rock star, and I'm happy that she's here today. So everyone, let's welcome Anne Marie to the stage.
Elevator music. It's fantastic. It goes really well with lunch. All right. So, can y'all hear me? Yeah. All right. Fantastic. Before we begin, that intro is I think it's the last time I keynoted FutureCon. It's a little out of date. I've been doing this for 27 years, and I've been in 9 industries. The last one, gaming, where I was credited on the latest release of Call of Duty. So that's fun. It's always interesting when you get to like ShmooCon, and someone walks up to you and says, "Oh my God, I saw your name on the Call of Duty." And I'm like, "You did? Cool, I didn't know that. Fantastic." So, you know, it's a little fun time. Today I'm here as a fellow of the National Security Institute. My general disclosure is that the opinions expressed here are my own and are not reflective of any current or past employer that I had. I also have had an asthma attack right before I came in, so you will hear me cough. I don't have a disease, I just have asthma. Does anybody here relate to the change in weather and the perils that it gives us? Thank you. Thanks, appreciate you. Okay, so while you guys are enjoying your lunch, we're gonna have a little discussion about the costs of a cyber attack, not just a data breach, but also ransomware, and all kinds of things. And my goal for you today is to arm you with ideas, with talk tracks, with methodologies to translate this risk to your partners in the business. Remember, in security, we are enablers for the business. I like to call myself the security Sherpa. Right? I'm not here because I just want to run up that mountain. Companies pay us to get them to their goals securely and safely. That means that we really have to understand what they want to do, why they want to do it, where they want to go at any given time so that we can develop something that is actually fit for purpose. In our industry, sometimes we get a bad reputation for being the land of no, or the land of checklists, or perhaps just being there for our own sake. And I challenge you to challenge that perspective by really getting to know the business and speaking in that language so that they can understand what the security risks are. Okay, so we're gonna talk about why does this matter, knowing your audience, knowing your company, understanding some benchmarks, and then how to run the risks. In the previous sessions, we went through a lot of data. I'm also a data scientist in one of those things, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about the usefulness of metrics and the usefulness of data, and you may not be what you think it is, okay? Because every decision that we make, even on the business side, has emotion in it. It has experience, it has judgment. I bet if you asked anybody in your company, what was the last, or even in your life, what was the last decision that you made strictly based on data, they would be hard pressed to tell you what that was. So a lot of this bleeds into our roles as advisors and taking a holistic look at something in order to provide counsel so that the businesses can make sound decisions. Sound good? Cool. All right. Moving along. All right, the rise of data breaches. Now, just out of curiosity, in this room here, and I know we have folks online. Hello, folks online. How many people have been in the industry for less than 3 years in this room? 7 years. 10 years. 15 years. Who's old like me? Over 15 years. Okay. All right. So we have a wide range, cross-section of different levels of experience and roles here. There may be things here that you know, things that you don't know. You never know what's going to resonate when we go through stuff. So if you've seen something that you already know, give yourself a pat on the back. But we know that the frequency of data breaches are growing, right? We also know that there's an escalating severity of the breaches, and part of that is due because we have an expanding attack surface, right? The attack surface isn't just our networks, but it's our people, it's our IoT, it's all of the things that are connected and the things that we don't know that are connected. Our shadow IT is through the roof. It just keeps going and going and going, right? And then we have different regulations and our threat landscape on what the ramifications are of not protecting those assets, not understanding what that attack surface is growing more and more in pretty much every jurisdiction in the world. I can tell you, having had experience with a company that was shut down in a country from doing any business because they didn't comply with that country's cybersecurity rules, and we had to re-platform every single piece of technology so that it was on soil, it can be a very big thing. And that is very different than 10 years ago. You would be hard-pressed to find an example where companies had to stop operations because of that regulation, and part of that's because they just did not exist. So, just like we have to stay ahead of the threats, we also have to educate ourselves on what we have to do. And that all comes into this talk today. There's that Maslow's hierarchy of needs in security, right? Your have-tos, keep everybody out of jail. What makes sense, and what our ideal is, right? But knowing this part here is harder and harder every day because we have all of these new things coming at us that we have to comply with. And that's why it's really important to build these bridges with people in your company, in legal, and in the CFO shop, and all kinds of things, because they will be able to help inform you what matters from their perspective and what doesn't, okay? All right, so the financial aspect of a data breach is comprised of several things. We talked a little bit about them. The incident response costs are usually the smallest, right? You saw some stats of 4.8 million for a data breach. We're going to go over some of that later. Some of you may think that's not going to resonate with my people at all. 4 million, and maybe you're in a public company, or maybe you're in a private company or state and local where it does. But having been in many enterprises before, depending on your risk tolerance, some of those things just fall flat, like they're willing to take the risk, right? But it's the tail of the incident that really can have some teeth budget-wise. So we have legal and regulatory fees, we have lost business. If you are hit with a destructive attack and you're not able to transact, or you have a DDoS and you can't get customers to your site, or any business disruption, that is becoming more and more prevalent too. And then, of course, the sheer cost of actually managing the public aspect of the incident, because now we're required to report in a lot of ways, can be pretty significant. Reputational damage. I put Equifax up here because a lot of people say to me, well, Equifax really didn't have that much of a problem. Like, they've rebounded. Yes, they have. 8 years later, right? or even 2 years later, or even 3 years later. And there will be people in the room that will say to you, oh, they had these fines, big deal. Do you know how much money Equifax makes? Yes, I do. And the fine from this one, the cost from this data breach, which was enough to wipe out net revenue for 2.5 years. How many of you know what net revenue is? What about EBITDA? What about a 10K? Okay. When you talk to the folks that create the budgets, the CFO shop, this is part of the language that they speak. What would happen to your own company's budgets, performance, bonuses, hiring patterns if they had no net revenue, if they had all of their earnings wiped out for the next year or two because of an incident? It's material. Materiality is another big concept that has been around for ages, for hundreds of years in accounting and finance, literally 100 years, that security is just starting to learn, right? So we talk about who should care about this. And I put should in here because, sometimes we feel like they don't, right? The board of directors, now I used to be on a public board, and there are new requirements from SEC, which kind of vacillates a little bit, and others about having security risk expertise on the board for these purposes. Audit committees are shoring up into the security space. I think it's the AICPA. Your executives, legal teams, investors, customers, regulatory bodies, all these people should. But maybe you're sitting in this room because you're going to say to me, yeah, they should, but it feels like they don't, right? How many people feel like sometimes the message lands flat? So, yeah, right? And we're like, but they're not listening to me. Part of that is because we don't do a good job of translating what we think is needed based on their business priorities. Our role in managing risk, in managing security, is that it is a risk equation, okay? Security is an operational risk. You know who's accountable for operational risk in most public companies? It's the CFO. And usually when they're talking about that, they're talking about the ability for top line to be protected, for expenses, for that EBITDA margin, your operating margin. And these are terms that if you don't know what they are, you should familiarize yourselves with them. Because if you're going to ask for more budget, it's going to increase that operating margin and decrease the profitability in some areas. You have increased chargebacks per se. So how do you sell something like that? How do you make it matter? It's not always easy. And part of that is, again, because we are not speaking the right language. Translating cybersecurity risk to an accountant, and I used to be one, and an auditor, and a controller. I've built companies, I've restructured billion-dollar companies. All of that language is in the CFO speak. You didn't know that, as well as a lot of security principles. Most of the CEOs, for example, not most, 38%, I think is the last stat I saw, for CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, as well as on board of directors, have MBAs. They come from functional areas of the business, but the leadership level, once they get there, it is all about business languages. So if we talk about the need for MFA, if we talk about the need for patching, if we talk about the need for fixing, we have to include how that's going to impact the business goals. And I suspect, I'm talking to a lot of my peers, that many of us have not spent a lot of time really understanding how a company makes money, what their levers are for the market, really understanding what the industry is, which means that's going to inform how we do threat modeling and how we manage risk for what's important and not important. When was the last time you sat with a CFO or anyone from the finance team and talked about level of loss? Talked about what their threshold of loss would be for an incident. We talk to our IT teams sometimes, on business continuity measures, just almost always, whether or not they have a hot site 25 miles from another hot site or 50, right? If there's a tornado, it doesn't matter if you are geographically close or not close in a cyber attack, right? We forget that part. But we don't talk to our finance partners about what would create a write-down in assets. What would create a significant impact that would have to be reported in a financial statement? What would be embarrassing, for example, to a company from a reputation perspective if you had to go in front of Congress, which has happened many times, on a security incident? And that's just not for the big guys. It's not just for the huge enterprises. That happens with state, local, public safety, schools, all kinds of things. What happens if you get federal lawsuits? We're going to go through some of those examples. So, really understanding the business risks and profiles are absolutely important to any context of the cost of a breach, right, or the cost of a ransomware. It's very specific to your company. What I don't want you to do is parrot back to your team's $335 per record of exposed breach, which we don't even really study anymore because there's so many variables with that, right? That is a 40% increase from 2018, I think. But remember when we used to quote that? How much was a cost of one record? $335? Did anybody else read the report where it says that actually cannot be extrapolated because of all of the factors that go around to individual companies? Averages are just averages, right? They're not actually going to help you, but they could be other than having a starting point to the conversation on how to value this type of risk and what the cost might be for your company. So how do you do this? How do you get to know your company really well? Well, if you're in a public company, start with their annual filings. I can't tell you how many times I've sat with peers and they've never read the 10K. They have no idea. They haven't read their 8K. They haven't read their material disclosures about the security incidents. And they all have to be in there. So if you're trying to even gain some knowledge about your industry and you're in a private company, these are good places to start on what competitors might be, right? Because there's definitely a public aspect to whatever type of company you are, unless you're in like strictly government. But even then, you could probably gain some insight from reading about companies that are public that can give you that type of insight, right? The other thing that people miss a lot when we talk about costs and liability is your contract analysis. Has anybody here ever pulled contracts from their customers and read them? I'm a big nerd, so I do it everywhere I go. What's interesting about contracts, every company I've been in, and I've been in more than 20 in a material way, the contracts that they write for their customers are all different. And when you get to security, that means in some cases, they will commit to that customer that they can report a breach, for example, in 48 hours. In other ones, it might be 4 hours. It might be 7 days. How do you build a security function that can meet those? Which one do you pick? Right? If you're working with legal, what do you do? What is the liability for not complying with something like that? There are definitely clauses within the contracts for your company's customers or whomever you may serve that require who are they going to report incidents to? Sometimes they're all over the place. How are they going to handle it? Do you have patching requirements? What happens if you don't comply? I've seen contracts that have fines built into them in the hundreds of thousands. Many of them are millions. I've seen some that are unlimited liability. Can you imagine how that thing got through? So when we talk about the cost of a data breach for your company or your organization, take a look at what you're going to be liable for. Do you have adequate, do they have adequate insurance for that? Work with your legal and finance team to understand the context. Don't just try to read it on your own, right, and come up with your own analysis. Reach across to your partners and say, hey, I've looked at these patterns in these contracts, and do you know our range of security expectations for our customers are this big. It's like catching a fish, right? I used to be an accountant, guys. These are the jokes. All right. I also encourage you to look at your strategic plans and your budgets and see how your own security programs can meet that. And maybe you haven't done that before, and you might have a little trouble articulating how the security can actually enable a top-line function, whether it's innovation or trust or revenue growth. That's when you start meeting across the aisle again to get context from those partners to see how you can help engineering. What would happen if marketing was deploying a new ad and your site got redirected in the middle of the Super Bowl? That's happened before in companies I've been in, right? We spend millions and millions of dollars. And is $20 million a big deal for that particular company when they're raking in billions? Probably not. But that opportunity and that exposure during the Super Bowl to have something redirected or something bad come up on the screen in the middle of millions and millions of people looking at it, it's probably not something marketing has considered, right? But it's something you can help solve. So we talked about the regulatory landscape. Here are 4 big types of compliance things that are out there right now. Maybe you don't know about GDPR, but that's in the European Union. It's very comprehensive. When it first came out, it was a liability of up to, I think, 2% of gross revenue as a fine. And part of this, the outcome of this is that the cost of data breaches for companies in the UK, for example, is about 1.9% now of their revenue. And the frequency of getting a data breach is at least, that can constitute that is at least once a year. Now I'm going to go back over this again, but think about what that means. 1.9% might not mean a lot to you if you don't know what your revenue is or what your budget is if you're, in the government or state agency where you have an operating budget. But that is absolutely material because your security budget is usually between 8 and 13%. In big companies, it's as low as 2% of your IT budget. So fractions and fractions and fractions of that 2% of revenue is what we actually spend on for security. Imagine if we actually operated security to not even optimal levels, but basics of hygiene. So when you start talking about ROI with your finance team, these are powerful pieces to understand and bring up in languages they're going to understand. So company filings, this just shows how Fortune 500 companies or public companies in general are increasing their disclosures of cyber risk and cyber incidents in their filings, which again is rough. And if you've ever talked to someone who's been through an incident and has to disclose that to their investors in a material way, never waste a good incident, right? It can be, it's traumatic. But the longer they get away from that, the more apathetic they type of get. But the point is, it's starting to become a regular thing. talk about this with the SEC. But it's not just the SEC that has oversight. There are other government bodies, not just in the US, but if you are international or at the state level, that are going to have interest in security breaches. So you might hear people say, as an objection to you, there's not going to be a lot of audits this year at the federal level. You might hear that, right, given all the change that's going on. But there will be at the state. The state hasn't changed. There will be internationally. Internationally hasn't changed. Okay? And if you operate anywhere, you at least operate in a state, you know, and then there are jurisdictions below that as well. And then there are industry regulations too, right? Like PCI and HIPAA that are important. I'm going to talk about an example of what a cost might look like. Now, Clorox suffered a material event in 2023. It was a ransomware attack with data exfiltration, okay? They were not able to operate for a while. They had widespread disruption, and it impacted their customers. Now, part of the ramifications of that cost, wasn't just $49 million in expenses with an additional $50 to $60 million in the coming years. Remember, that tail is huge. But for a time, the brand lost trust with its customers. Now, as an objection, you may hear people say, well, how is that reflected? In the stock market, do they come back? In Clorox, it took them 18 to 24 months, but they regained 90% of their customer base after the attack. And part of that, I think, is because, you know, of their dominance in the market. But what if you had a different, you know, entrant in the market that could take that? Those are things that you would talk to the CFO about. What would happen if we lost share of the market for a period of time? And what does that period of time look like? I'm willing to bet that that's not been a usual conversation that many of us have had on a repeated basis. What does it look like if we lose customer confidence for X period of time? How does it impact us financially? Because this is what can happen. You may see people talk about impact to stock prices. And while that's true, in the immediate, usually it rebounds within a quarter or two, okay? So that stat and that kind of trove is from years ago. But now we've seen that, you know, it comes back. But if you're in the middle of an acquisition, or if you're in the middle of going public, in which you wouldn't have a stock price, your valuation could go down. And we've seen impacts with that too. Like with Uber, like with Yahoo. Talked about some financial risks. In the previous conversation, the previous session, they talked about Change Healthcare, which is a part of United Health. An example here, okay, in the healthcare industry, this was 100 million people affected. There was disruption of services. There was widespread impact to third parties. They paid the ransom. But you know what that did? That made the attackers say, oh, this is a pretty easy target. And so they started attacking other companies where they thought they would like companies to get more attacks. So ramifications for this were pretty widespread. It took a really long time, and then they just kept getting re-breached. And so here's an example of where there may not have been a federal lawsuit yet. The state of Nevada did sue for failure to implement basic security measures with Change Healthcare. And the thing with Clorox also is that, you know how you might get some folks that aren't willing to patch things, and you get things that are years old. And they say, oh, we can kick it off to next year, kick it off to next year. Clorox had material findings because in their audit reports, they showed material security weaknesses in 2 of the years before that they were audited. And they just let it ride until a big pop came, right? And that's not a moral judgment of the company at all. Every company has significant security debt, even new ones, like right out the gate. Startups always have huge ones. But it's not always direct financial impact, like paying a ransom, right? We're talking about costs of incident. Costs come in many forms. They come in what you have to pay, fines, hiring legal teams, redeveloping infrastructure, mitigating risk, rebuilding things, having to constantly deal with the onslaught of inquiries, lawsuits, complaints. It goes on forever, right? So one of these particular ones with National Public Data, which was a background check company, actually filed bankruptcy because of their hit. So less than a year later, their parent company filed bankruptcy because of this data breach that included PII and Social Security numbers. It also had multiple investigations and multiple lawsuits from not just federal, but local jurisdictions as well. Another example that you can dig further into. AutoNation, this particular attack was from one of their third parties. Again, it's not always us, right? We can be the attack vector, and so can our third parties, right? Anybody is subject to this, by the way, right? It's not like anybody here is all buttoned up, but even then, what did the Godfather teach us? You can get to anyone, right? Nobody knows that reference. I'm the only old one here in the room. Okay. All right. Okay, afternoon. But it's true. And so here, your CFO might want to know that the net earnings per share went down $1.55. Net income dropped 52% from the previous year. 52%, that's huge. That's a lot. People get fired for that. Board gets upset. Nobody likes that. It's bad. Now, it's not always about money. Sometimes it's about reputation. And, if you're public, they go hand in hand too. I would say even private also. But who remembers Midnight Blizzard? How can you forget? It's the gift that keeps on giving. So Midnight Blizzard compromised Microsoft and HPE, Hewlett-Packard, targeting specific email accounts of executives. How many people are familiar with this breach? Oh, okay. Not a lot. Now, this wasn't a mass exfiltration of email accounts like the Deloitte breach was in, I think, 2015, right? Remember that? Like every email was, accessible. Here, they specifically targeted executives. Why do you think they might do that? Where do you think the strategic information is? They took the emails out. They took the attachments out. And they found they had been running around the networks for a very long time. And there's still repercussions for that. And we had to, there were testimonies to Congress about that. Still. And the ramifications were double down on security for Microsoft throughout the company. Security priority number 1. There were additional inquiries from congressional bodies, but working groups from CISA and others that mandated, they didn't really have the authority to do so, but mandated or suggested that Microsoft and others pause development on new features in order to fix debt. If you're not familiar with this particular piece, I suggest and really hope that you Google that, because here you have working groups, public-private partnerships that are calling out companies to do better, and the ramifications of that were that the companies had to respond. People were not going to forget that. And at the time, there were other federal agencies that are sort of on the way to being defunct now, but that doesn't mean that you don't have state and local, that also created massive fines for similar situations with other companies. And that all of that is new too. So the cost of a data breach or the cost of an incident is multifaceted. It's multi-factor. But what's going to resonate with the executives in your company, right, or your partners, is what happens to the financial impact, the financial bottom line of that company. What happens, if an executive, a CEO, a CISO is called up into Congress? This last year, we have criminal charges for CISOs, right? We have class action lawsuits against CISOs. We have firings of CEOs for material breaches. All of that is relatively new in the last 10 years, 6 years, I would say, right? So other things to consider here. I wanted to give you guys some data to start with, and here's where the data scientist in me is going to come out, okay? Please do not take blind snippets of metrics or stats that you see in presentations and just paste them everywhere. Don't do that, because that will give someone ripe opportunity to just debate that with you. Remember what I mentioned is that the folks on the business side, they deal in numbers all day. It's great being a nerd, I deal with numbers all day because once you're an accountant, you're always an accountant, I think. But they will debate them with you. They'll talk about sample size and whether or not it's relevant over here, and could that really happen to us? And oh, it's not relevant, So this whole talk up until now is taking some of these and contextualizing it to your industry, to your company, to the type of products that you develop, to the type of services that you offer, okay? So that you could have meaningful conversations about what the actual cost is. But here are some thoughts, okay? We talked about that average cost per record. I put it in there because I knew somebody was going to ask me about it later. And directionally is usually your safest bet. Why? Because you have competing studies. The Ponemon Institute with IBM, the Verizon Data Breach Report, those are really good studies to read every single year, right? But you also have studies that are developed by a bunch of other vendors, research institutes, that are going to give you numbers that don't look like these. And you're going to say, Amzi, how do I know which one's real? I want you to look at the trends, okay? Directionally, things are increasing. And they're increasing in a material way. I'm going to say material all day, right? The average basic cost is going up 10%, according to IBM. Verizon Data Breach would say that the average cost per record is going up 40%. What's the common trend? It's going up, right? It's going up. When I talk about materiality, materiality means that it can affect the decision of an investor. It can affect the decision of investment, okay? Material to a company. So significant attacks are increasing. And Fortinet is also puts out great research too. And it says that 87% of organizations experienced one or more breaches in the past year. Now, from a data scientist, you might ask, who's part of that sample size? I would say it's statistically significant. And so you might not want to say 87%. You might want to say in your conversations, most companies, majority of companies in our industry. And a lot of these studies will give you context of your specific industry, or at least your geolocation, global versus domestic. We talk a lot about public companies because they're the ones that have to disclose everything, right? But we also have research on education from CISA. It's a great place to go for stats and an understanding of your business. So let's talk about like education, for example, right? Ransomware attacks for K through 12 organizations increased from 92% in just in 1 year. We're talking school districts that are easily targeted and they paid the ransom. And so what does that do to the attacker? Well, I'm going to go pay the other ransom. So when we think about how I'm going to attack another soft target, when they feel like, oh, who could possibly want to attack me? In fact, I just had this conversation the other day where, and I've had it more than once, which is interesting, where folks say, well, I'm just not, my company is just not, my organization is just not exciting enough for an attacker. Has anybody heard that? I see some people laughing, right? Sure, if you're going to go to DEF CON or Black Hat, which I do every year, it's fantastic, researchers might want big fish, right? And that's a certain type of threat actor. For every one of those, there are thousands where this is just a job. Think about your job. Do you want to go and do things in the hardest way possible? No, you want to go in, grab it, break it, smash it, go out and go home, get your kids to soccer. They have kids too. You know, a lot of these are criminal enterprises, are businesses. They have help centers, right? You know, I mean, they really do. They do. They have call centers. So they have goals. They want to get the easiest way to make money and leave. So anybody that is a soft target that they think might pay a ransom or they might have any type of benefit, they're going to get at you. Remember when there was a spy that came in to steal the formula for white paint from DuPont? I used to use that example a lot when people said, oh, nobody wants to talk about my business. I said, well, if they're going to spend 10 years and millions of dollars to plant someone in there to steal paint, it's not paint, it's actually extremely expensive to develop white paint for that type of use. But odds are, if they want to target K through 12 to get a couple million, easy, right? And then lastly, if you're in small and medium-sized businesses, 43% of attacks are going towards you. It's not just the big fish. It's any opportunity to get paid. Any opportunity. And on top of that, you have people that are just, yes, there's a whole trove of threat actors that are looking just to YOLO and run around in networks and figure out what they can do because they can. Spray and pray, script kiddies all over the place. So it's important to know what type of threat actors are targeting your industry as well. Oh, one more thing I want to reemphasize. When you're talking about cost, they're going to say a lot of this like, so what? What do you want from it? Let's say you get to the point in the conversation. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, say you get to the point in conversation where they say, okay, I get it. What do you want? What do you want? Be prepared to answer that question. And then they'll ask, how do you know it's going to be effective? Here's what I want you to remember here. They might say to you, and people that are, not familiar with how sensitive revenue targets can be, will say, what's 1.9% of revenue? Huge! It's huge, right? In Change Healthcare, in United Healthcare, you saw a stat up there that said that breach alone could have cost $3 billion, right? $3 billion. How much is that compared to the revenue of United Healthcare? It's less than 1%. Okay, so these numbers kind of hold, you know, in a lot of examples. But if you say to them, look, are we investing in the right ways? If you've been starved for budget, right? If you've been starved for resources, these are some things that maybe can help normalize the conversation or open the conversation. But I will ask you one favor here. Not everything is a budget problem. Okay? Budget is not going to solve problems with process, problems with not deploying your tech stack right, not actually actioning your things unless it's about people, right? You've got to, when you go in for that ask and you're asking for more funding, make sure you're talking about what the impact of that funding would be, that you're going to be changing processes, and that takes time and that takes money as well, right? It's not just to get money to increase your budget. Please don't do that. That is not going to help you actually improve security. Okay. So now we're at the end. We don't have time for questions, but what I will commit to you is that I will be around for a little while after the talk. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to continue the conversation there. But even if you're not going to continue it with me, I encourage you to take some of these pieces, even if it's just one that you're curious about, and ask yourself, do I really know my business enough to start quantifying some of these things? What is the average cost to me? And you might want to employ some risk methodologies with that. I would encourage you to do so. There are several out there that are good, but you're not, FAIR is a good one, for example. But you're not going to know which one is good unless that for your company if you don't really understand how the company operates and how it makes money and what is impactful to them. So with that, I thank you for listening to me on your lunch hour. I hope everybody has a lovely day. I thank you for your time.
And
37 seconds to spare. About that.
I have an online question.
I will. Okay, go ahead.
It's from David Zor. How can organizations quantify reputational damage following a data breach? Are there any industry benchmarks?
That is a good question. So on a public company, well, not even on a public company, there's something called goodwill in the balance sheet. Most CFOs will tell you that they don't write that thing down too much and it's not really a consideration. It is technically, but you can see reputational damage hit to the goodwill asset in a balance sheet. But you should do research on what that means for your company before you bring that up with your CFO. The other thing about reputation, though, is not necessarily, that's more of a qualifying risk than a quant risk, right? So reputation could lead to, there are benchmarks and stats that will talk about whether or not consumers will walk away from your product and for how long. Remember, we talked about sitting down with your partners and saying, what would it mean if we lost market share, even temporarily? What would it mean for us in this year? Maybe they can weather it this year. Maybe you're in a position where all you care about to keep the doors open and the lights on is top line, is revenue, in which case everything sort of goes to the wayside. What happens if you have a material event where people don't want to do business with you because they're afraid of their own PII or privacy or what have you? There's many, many examples about that. And we can, online person, feel free to reach out to me and we can give you some more examples. Okay? Thanks, everybody.